Roger Waters spent decades blaming fame, pressure, and creative differences for the collapse of Pink Floyd. But behind the legendary albums and sold-out stadiums was something much uglier that slowly destroyed the band from the inside. Long before the lawsuits, before Roger Waters walked away, and before fans started choosing sides between Waters and David Gilmour, the damage had already been done. According to Waters himself, Pink Floyd may have actually died years earlier than most people realize. And the deeper he talks about those final years, the more heartbreaking the story becomes. Roger Waters was born on September 6, 1943, in Surrey, England. By the time Pink Floyd became one of the biggest bands in the world, Waters had transformed from a quiet art student into one of rock music's most controlling and ambitious creative forces. Alongside Syd Barrett, Nick Mason, and Richard Wright, he helped build Pink Floyd in the mid-1960s into a band unlike anything audiences had seen before. Their early music was strange, experimental, and heavily shaped by Barrett's imagination. But after Barrett's mental collapse and departure from the group, everything changed. David Gilmour joined to stabilize the band, and over time, Waters quietly began taking more creative control. At first, the arrangement worked. Albums like Dark Side of the Moon turned Pink Floyd into global superstars. The record sold millions upon millions of copies and remained on the charts for years. Suddenly, the band was no longer a cult progressive rock group experimenting in underground clubs. They had become one of the most successful acts on Earth. But success created a problem none of them knew how to handle. Waters later admitted that after Dark Side of the Moon, something inside the group began to disappear. The friendships that once held the band together slowly started breaking apart under the pressure of fame, money, and constant expectations to create another masterpiece. The next album, Wish You Were Here, was supposed to be a tribute to Syd Barrett, the friend they had lost emotionally long before they lost him physically. But while recording it, Waters began noticing something disturbing inside the studio. He no longer felt connected to the other members. Years later, he openly admitted that Wish You Were Here was, in his opinion, the last real Pink Floyd album. That statement shocked many fans because the band would still go on to release massive records afterward, including Animals and The Wall. But Waters believed the emotional unity was already gone by then. He explained that Wish You Were Here was not only about Syd Barrett, it was also about absence inside the band itself. According to Waters, the members had stopped truly communicating with each other creatively. Everyone was physically present, but emotionally drifting apart. The warmth that once existed during the band's rise had turned cold. Even while creating some of the most celebrated music in rock history, the members were quietly becoming strangers. That emotional collapse became more obvious during the making of Animals. Waters grew increasingly dominant, writing more material while the others contributed less and less. From Waters' perspective, he had no choice because the others were no longer motivated enough to push the band forward creatively. But from the perspective of David Gilmour and the others, Waters' ego was becoming unbearable. They believed he had started viewing himself as Pink Floyd rather than one member of it. And as the success continued growing larger, so did the resentment behind closed doors. By the time Pink Floyd started working on The Wall, the atmosphere inside the band had become toxic. Roger Waters was no longer simply the bassist or one of the songwriters. He had become the unquestioned leader of the project, and everyone around him felt it. Nearly every major idea on the album came from Waters himself, including the storyline, the themes, and most of the lyrics. David Gilmour still contributed important musical moments, including parts of Run Like Hell and Young Lust, but even Waters later admitted that The Wall was essentially his own record. Producer Bob Ezrin became one of the only people Waters truly collaborated with during the process, while the rest of Pink Floyd slowly lost influence over the music they were supposedly creating together. The situation became even worse for keyboardist Richard Wright. Waters had grown frustrated with what he saw as Wright's declining creative contributions and lack of engagement in the studio. According to Waters, Wright had mentally checked out long before recording sessions for The Wall even began. But the way Waters handled the problem permanently damaged the band's relationships. During the recording process, Waters demanded that Wright leave Pink Floyd entirely. The pressure became so intense that Wright eventually agreed to quit, though he still toured with the band afterward as a paid musician rather than an official member. For many fans, this was the moment Pink Floyd truly broke apart emotionally. Even though the group remained commercially successful, the trust between the members had collapsed. Wright later admitted how painful the experience had been, while Waters insisted years later that people misunderstood the situation. According to him, Pink Floyd had already split up years before, emotionally, and Wright's departure was simply the public confirmation of something that had already happened privately inside the studio. Ironically, while the band was falling apart behind the scenes, The Wall became one of the biggest albums of their career. Songs like Comfortably Numb became legendary. But even that iconic song carried traces of Waters' growing psychological isolation. He later revealed that the inspiration for Comfortably Numb came from a terrifying experience during a concert stop in Philadelphia. Waters had become violently ill before a performance and believed he would not be able to go on stage. A doctor came to his hotel room and injected him with medication that left him barely able to move. Waters said he performed the entire concert in a strange, detached state, almost disconnected from his own body. That disturbing emotional numbness later became the foundation for one of the most famous songs Pink Floyd ever recorded. At the same time, another tension was quietly growing inside the band. David Gilmour and Waters increasingly disagreed on the emotional direction of Pink Floyd's music. Gilmour preferred balance, atmosphere, and melody, while Waters pushed harder toward darker personal themes and political anger. Those differences had always existed to some degree, but during The Wall, they became impossible to hide. Interviews from that period reveal a group barely functioning as a team anymore. The success remained enormous, but internally, Pink Floyd had become a battlefield where nobody trusted each other completely. If The Wall exposed the fractures inside Pink Floyd, then the final cut completely destroyed whatever remained of the band's unity. By that stage, Roger Waters had almost total control over the music, and even he would later admit that the album felt more like a solo project than a true Pink Floyd record. Unlike previous albums where David Gilmour or Richard Wright still brought important creative ideas into the studio, the final cut revolved almost entirely around Waters' writing, politics, and personal emotions. The themes were darker, more bitter, and deeply connected to Waters' lifelong anger about war, authority, and the death of his father during World War II. But the deeper problem was not simply the music itself. It was the atmosphere surrounding its creation. David Gilmour later described making the album as torture. According to him, Waters had started reviving material originally rejected during the Wall sessions and insisted it now belonged on the new album. Gilmour openly questioned why songs considered not good enough earlier were suddenly acceptable now. The disagreements became so exhausting that Waters eventually pushed Gilmour away from the production process almost entirely. After constant arguments and emotional exhaustion, Gilmour agreed to remove himself from parts of the production credits simply to avoid further conflict. Nick Mason later confirmed how miserable the sessions had become. He admitted that everyone involved understood the band was no longer functioning properly. In his view, it was not the way a real group should make music together. There was very little joy left in the process. Instead of collaboration, the studio had become a place dominated by tension, silence, and resentment. Each member seemed emotionally isolated from the others, and conversations reportedly became colder and more hostile as the sessions continued. Commercially, the final cut still performed reasonably well, selling millions of copies worldwide, but compared to the overwhelming success of albums like Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall, the response was noticeably weaker. More importantly, the emotional damage inside the band had reached the point of no return. Waters had become convinced that Pink Floyd was effectively over already. From his perspective, the other members were no longer contributing enough creatively to justify continuing as a real band. But Gilmour and Mason believed the exact opposite. They felt Waters had slowly pushed everyone aside because he no longer respected their input. That disagreement became the heart of Pink Floyd's collapse. Waters saw himself carrying the creative burden almost alone. The others saw him becoming increasingly arrogant and impossible to work with. Neither side fully accepted the other's version of events, and over time the resentment hardened into permanent bitterness. When Roger Waters officially left Pink Floyd in 1985, he genuinely believed the band could not continue without him. In his mind, Pink Floyd had already creatively collapsed years earlier, and his departure simply made the ending official. Waters often argued that David Gilmour was primarily a musical craftsman rather than a lyrical visionary, while Nick Mason focused more on rhythm and atmosphere than conceptual storytelling. Waters believed he had become the central creative engine of the group, especially after Wish You Were Here. So when he walked away, he assumed the story of Pink Floyd was over forever. But the situation quickly turned ugly once David Gilmour and Nick Mason decided to continue using the Pink Floyd name without him. Waters was furious. To him, the band no longer existed spiritually or creatively. Seeing the others move forward felt almost like watching strangers wear the identity he believed he had built. The disagreement escalated into a massive legal battle over ownership of the Pink Floyd name and rights connected to the band's legacy. For a period of time, the feud became one of the nastiest conflicts in rock music history. Eventually, the lawsuit was settled outside of court, allowing Gilmour and Mason to continue as Pink Floyd. Richard Wright later returned as an official member, something many fans viewed as symbolic justice after the painful way he had been pushed out years earlier. Waters, meanwhile, moved forward with his solo career and publicly insisted he had no regrets. But despite those statements, his interviews over the following decades often revealed lingering bitterness about how everything unfolded. At the same time, Waters also began reflecting more honestly on his own role in the collapse. In some interviews, he admitted that he could be defensive, controlling, and difficult. By his 70s, he appeared far calmer than the angry figure many fans remembered from earlier decades. He even joked about finally realizing late in life that audiences actually loved him. Waters recalled a charity concert in Los Angeles where he suddenly felt a wave of affection from the crowd, unlike anything he had experienced before. He admitted the moment genuinely shocked him, because for much of his career he approached performing with discomfort rather than joy. That emotional shift became more visible during later tours and interviews. Waters started speaking more openly about fear, insecurity, and emotional isolation. One story especially surprised fans. He confessed that one of the most terrifying experiences of his life was not playing stadium concerts, but speaking in front of 80 schoolchildren at his son's school. The anxiety became so intense that he could barely sleep beforehand. Waters later described the experience as something that forced him to confront parts of himself he had ignored for years. Even his reflections on Pink Floyd became more complicated over time. While he still defended many of his creative decisions, he occasionally admitted he could remember events incorrectly and said he was prepared to be wrong about everything. For longtime fans, that statement sounded almost unbelievable, coming from a man famous for decades of certainty and confrontation. One of the most painful parts of Roger Waters' story is that even after decades passed, he still seemed haunted by the feeling that Pink Floyd lost its soul long before the public realized it. He repeatedly returned to the same emotional turning point. Wish You Were Here. To most fans, the album represented another masterpiece in a legendary catalog. But to Waters, it symbolized something far darker. He believed it was the last time the members truly created music together as a unified band before the emotional distance became irreversible. Part of that pain came from Syd Barrett's lingering shadow over everything Pink Floyd became. Barrett had originally been the heart of the band during its earliest psychedelic years, but his mental collapse permanently changed the group's identity. Waters later admitted that Wish You Were Here was not simply about missing Syd as a person. It reflected his growing awareness that everyone inside Pink Floyd was emotionally drifting away from each other. Even while standing together in recording studios and stadiums, the connection was disappearing. That emotional isolation became stronger as Waters gained more control creatively. Ironically, the same ambition that helped produce albums like The Wall also deepened the divisions inside the band. Waters pushed harder, demanded more, and became obsessed with maintaining artistic standards at a level few musicians could survive emotionally. Meanwhile, David Gilmour and the others increasingly felt excluded from decisions. The more successful Pink Floyd became, the more fragile their relationships turned behind the scenes. Waters' complicated personality also played a major role. Throughout his career, he developed a reputation for being defensive, confrontational, and difficult in interviews. Stories circulated for years about him reacting angrily whenever someone questioned his importance to Pink Floyd or mentioned reunion rumors. Even decades later, he still carried resentment over criticism dating back to the early 1990s, including a newspaper caption mocking the sound quality of his Berlin performance of The Wall. Small slights seemed to stay with him for years. At the same time, age appears to have softened parts of him emotionally. In later interviews, Waters sounded less interested in proving himself and more willing to examine his own mistakes. He openly admitted that success after Dark Side of the Moon created enormous psychological pressure inside Pink Floyd. Once the band achieved everything musicians dream about, wealth, critical praise, global fame, and record-breaking albums, the members no longer knew how to function normally together. David Gilmour later described the period after Dark Side of the Moon as emotionally difficult because all their childhood dreams had already come true. Instead of bringing peace, the achievement created exhaustion and tension that slowly poisoned the group. Perhaps that is the saddest truth behind Pink Floyd's ending. There was no single betrayal, no one explosive night where everything suddenly collapsed forever. The destruction happened gradually over years through ego, exhaustion, creative imbalance, unresolved resentment, and emotional distance. One masterpiece followed another while the friendships underneath quietly died. What do you think was the real reason Pink Floyd fell apart? Was Roger Waters right that the band emotionally ended during Wish You Were Here, or do you believe the group could have survived if the members had handled things differently? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more untold stories about music legends.